All right, skin disease. Skin disease. I want to say a few preliminary things before I go into some of the sections of chapters 13 and 14. First off, I've said this already, I think, but we need to distinguish between leprosy as we know it, and it's identified in the modern world as Hansen's. That's not the leprosy that is involved here in these chapters. If you had a modern equivalent, some of the forms of leprosy are scabs or scars from wounds. Some of them are scabs, scars from burns. It's a mark on the skin that's left over from a burn. Sometimes it's a swelling in the skin or a dip in the skin, flaking of the skin. If you're familiar with psoriasis, that would probably be a closer analogy than what we think of as leprosy. So it's not, these people are not suffering from a life-threatening illness. It's a form of uncleanness and not an illness. Second thing, the word for, or the phrase that's used for leprosy is a touch of skin disease. A touch of skin disease. Nega is touch. Oop, should be an A. It's touch. And the phrase is used throughout this. A touch of skin disease. Let me make that A little bit. Oop, I use this side. I'm such an old man. Nega. Okay. A touch of skin disease. The background of that word is partly in the plagues of Egypt. The plagues of Egypt are sometimes called touches, as in Exodus 11, verse 1. I'll read that. Now the Lord said to Moses, "One more plague I will bring on Pharaoh and on Egypt, and after that he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will surely drive you out from here completely." That's an announcement of the final plague, which is the Passover. And the word there, translated as plague, is this word nagah, which means, in other contexts, means a touch. Nagah, the verb, is the verb for touch. So the same word is used to describe plagues back in Genesis. Abraham goes into Egypt, you might remember. He spends some time in Egypt. He tells Pharaoh that Sarah is his sister, and Pharaoh takes Sarah into his house, and the Lord afflicts Pharaoh with plagues. This is the word that's being used in Genesis 12, in that kind of proto-Exodus episode. Excuse me. Everything that happens to Abraham in Genesis 12 is going to happen later to Israel in Egypt, including plagues that fall on the Egyptians. Okay. So making that connection, I think, helps us to see one layer or dimension of skin disease. One of the threats that the Lord brings against Israel if they break covenant is that he will inflict on them the diseases of Egypt. If they keep covenant, then he's going to remove the diseases of Egypt from them, and he's going to keep the diseases of Egypt from afflicting them. The fact that this skin disease is a touch or a plague of skin disease links it with the plagues in Egypt and indicates that this person who is suffering from the skin disease has a touch of Egypt in him, as it were. He's come up out of Egypt. He's made his way into the wilderness. He's on his way to the promised land, and yet there's a touch of Egypt still on him. This is a kind of symbolic version of what happens when Israel comes up into the wilderness, and the people continually complain about conditions in the wilderness, and a number of times they say, we're going to head back to Egypt because things were easier there. We'd rather be slaves in Egypt than out here in the wilderness. They've come out of Egypt, but Egypt is still with them. They're still acting like Egyptians tied back to Egypt. With the skin disease, they come up out of Egypt. They're going to be going into the land, but this touch of Egypt this touch of an Egyptian plague is still afflicting them. Okay. The third thing I want to say, and I mentioned this earlier today, and we'll look at this in more detail in just a few minutes. There are three different kinds of things that can contract skin disease, that can be touched by skin disease. There's the initial form, the primary form, that's described at length in Leviticus 13, and that is a disease touch on the skin itself. Then you can have something on a garment or on a vessel that's made of skin, that's made of leather, that can have a touch of skin disease. And then in chapter 14, you get houses that also can contract leprosy. That's the sequence, and they're all, as I said this morning, they're all versions of covering. Skin is the covering of our immediate covering of our body. Clothing is an extra layer of skin that we put on. Another covering that we make our dwellings, and all of those can be afflicted with skin disease. I said back this morning that the forms of impurity are linked to the curses of Genesis 3. So far, that's been a plausible, relatively easy thing to argue for. I don't know if I've convinced you, but I at least think it's made plausible arguments. The curse on the serpent is linked up with the Leviticus 11 and the unclean animals. The curse on childbirth in Genesis 3 is linked up with chapter 12, very obviously with chapter 12, and the uncleanness that follows childbirth. Now we get to chapters 13 and 14, and they have to do with skin disease. The next curse that comes in the sequence of curses in Genesis is the curse on Adam's work, and the sweat that appears on his brow or his nose. That's a sign of his curse. So can we make sense of a connection between sweat, that's a sign of the curse of the crown that revolts against man's dominion, and skin disease? Are those two things in any way similar to each other? I think they are, and I have several lines of reasoning to suggest that they are. First of all, the first thing is the location where skin disease appears. Skin disease, the most virulent form of skin disease, the worst form of skin disease, is skin disease that appears on a head, on the bald forehead. I'll go back to this in a bit, but look at chapter 13, verses 42 and following. If you're bald, you're clean. Good thing. I'm happy about that. But if on the bald head or the bald forehead there occurs a reddish-white infection, it is leprosy breaking out on the bald head or on his bald forehead. Then the priest shall look at him, and if the swelling and the infection is reddish-white on his bald head or on his bald forehead, like the appearance of leprosy in the skin of his body, he is a leprous man, he is unclean. He's pronounced unclean, and he has to go out of the camp. Okay, that's the most intense form of leprosy. And the location of this most intense form of leprosy is on the bald head or the bald forehead. It's visible right in the middle of the face, at the upper middle of the face. Okay, which is the location too of the sweat of the brow. You have leprosy breaking out somewhere in this region. You have sweat of the nose that's coming from the forehead and dripping off. So the location of leprosy and the location of sweat links them together metaphorically or symbolically. We also have episodes of skin disease where skin disease is concentrated on the forehead. Go to 2 Chronicles 26. This is part of the account of the reign of Uzziah. 2 Chronicles 26. The reign of Uzziah. Uzziah is a king in Judah, the southern kingdom. He's generally a faithful king and a successful king. He's able to reestablish the strength of Jerusalem, rebuilds parts of Jerusalem. He's able to repel enemies. But then, verse 16 of 2 Chronicles 26, when he became strong, Uzziah's heart was so proud that he acted corruptly, and he was unfaithful to the Lord his God, for he entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. Then Azariah the priest entered after him, and with him 80 priests of the Lord, valiant men. And they opposed Uzziah the king and said to him, "It is not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord, for the priests, the sons of Aaron, who are consecrated to burn incense. Get out of the sanctuary, for you have been unfaithful. You will have no honor from the Lord God. You've committed an act of unfaithfulness or an act of sacrilege." But Uzziah, with the censer in his hand for burning incense, was enraged. And while he was enraged with the priests, the leprosy broke out on his forehead before the priests in the house of the Lord beside the altar of incense. And Azariah, the chief priest, and all the priests looked at him, and behold, he was leprous on his forehead. And they hurried him out of there, and he himself was hastened to get out because the Lord had smitten him. And King Uzziah was a leper to the day of his death. He lived in a separate house, being a leper. So he's got the kind of leprosy that requires him to leave the common course of life. For he was cut off from the house of the Lord, so he can't go back into the temple at all. Jotham, his son, was over the king's house, judging the people of the land. Now the rest of the acts of Uzziah, first to last, the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amos, has written, and so on. Oh, I should read the last verse. So Uzziah slept with his fathers, and they buried him with his fathers in the field of the grave which belonged to the kings, for they said he is a leper. And Jotham, his son, became king in his place. Okay. So Uzziah becomes powerful, he becomes proud, and he tries to take the role of a priest. We've been talking about the standing that priests have in the sanctuary. Priests are the only ones that can go into the holy place. They're the only ones that can trim the wicks of the lampstand. They're the only ones that can change out the showbread. They're the only ones that can offer incense on a censer. But Uzziah gets his ego inflated and thinks, why do they get to do all that stuff? I'm the king. I'm a powerful king. So I should be able to do the stuff that the priests do. And so Uzziah usurps the role of the priest, takes a censer, and tries to go into the holy place of the temple. This is kind of a repetition of the sin of Nadab and Abihu, right? He's pretending to be a priest, and the result is that the Lord breaks out against him. The Lord doesn't break out to burn him as he does with Nadab and Abihu, but the Lord breaks out to strike him and touch him on the forehead with leprosy. And having been touched on the forehead with leprosy, he's excluded from common life. He's no longer actively functioning as the king of Israel. His son takes over that role. A couple things we can draw from this. One is the link between leprosy and rebellion against God. We see that in some other cases in the Old Testament. Probably the best known, most famous case is that of Miriam, who is Moses' sister, who, along with Aaron, speaks out against Moses and is struck with leprosy until Moses intercedes for her and the Lord cleanses her. But that's an act of rebellion against the authority of the Lord, but it's also an act of rebellion against the authority of Moses. We have a similar kind of thing here with Uzziah. He's breaking the Lord's commandments, obviously, but he's also defying the priests and defying the authority of priests. Even though you have Azariah the chief priest in there, and you have 80 other priests, verse 17, that are around him. They're doing what they're supposed to do. They're guarding the house. They're trying to keep an unauthorized stranger from getting into the house, in this case Uzziah. But he refuses to leave. So Uzziah is not only defying the Lord's commandment, but Uzziah is also defying the priests and defying the authority of the priests. So you have, in both the case of Miriam and the case of Uzziah, you have leprosy as a punishment for rebellion against the Lord that takes the form of rebellion against God's duly constituted authorities, Moses on the one hand and Uzziah and the priests on the other. So that's something to keep in mind as we think about skin disease, the fact that that's related to rebellion. I think that this is another aspect that will be relevant to us when we get to get back to chapter 13. Uzziah's particular defiance is to try to take on a priestly role and to offer incense. He's not a priest. He doesn't have the garments of a priest on. He doesn't have the high priestly garments on. He doesn't have the protective crown on his head the high priest wears. And he's struck with leprosy on the forehead. And in trying to usurp priesthood, he has the exact opposite effect, which is to exclude him completely from the house of God, and he's off outside of his own house. He lives in a separate house. He doesn't live in the palace anymore, and he can't go into the house of God. So he tries to usurp priestly privilege, and he becomes an anti-priest all the way outside the camp. And the mark of his anti-priesthood, the mark of his antithesis to the priesthood, is the mark on his forehead. Again, priests have a crown on the forehead. They're holy to the Lord. And that's what marks them publicly, visibly as the Lord's own servants. Now, Uzziah has a mark on his forehead, like a priest, but it's a mark that excludes him, the mark that announces that he is not fit to be a priest and not fit to go into the house of the Lord. So that connection between leprosy, forehead leprosy, and priesthood is going to be important when we get back to Leviticus 13. Okay. And then one of the things, the reason I came to this passage initially was to try to justify the connection that I'm drawing between sweat on the brow, which is the curse of Genesis 3, and the skin disease as a form of uncleanness. Sweat on the brow, skin disease on the forehead. In both cases, what we have is something from the inside seeping out or coming out from the inside. In Adam's case, it's sweat coming from the inside out on the particular location of the forehead. For the leper, it's the flesh or something underneath the skin that's pressing out and bursting out from underneath the skin, and the inside of man is not being kept inside, and the uncleanness of the flesh is becoming manifested on the forehead of the leper. What I've suggested is a couple of different reasons for seeing a link between work sweat in Genesis 3 and leprosy. One of them has to do with the location. They're on the forehead. If that seems like not a very strong link, remember that forms of uncleanness are associated with different parts of the body. Other kinds of uncleanness are associated with different parts of the body. As we'll see in chapter 15, the emissions come from the flesh. They're emissions that are associated with the genitals. They come from sexual organs. And so those are the communicators of uncleanness, those particular organs. So it's not impossible, kind of natural to think that the location of skin disease on the forehead, the location of the worst kind of skin disease on the forehead is an indicator, is a significant indicator, and takes us back again to Genesis 3. Okay, are you following what I've been saying? Yeah. So that's one link is the forehead. The other link is that you have something coming inside out that's already associated with a curse. The sweat that's coming from inside out to the outer skin, and the same thing is happening with the leper. One last thing I want to say before we look at the passages, and that is I think it's helpful to make this practical and to think how this might work how this might have some kind of application in the new covenant. It's helpful to see the analogy that's running through the whole sacrificial tabernacle Levitical system, analogy between the human body and the body of the community. The human body is an image of the community. This is a common ancient idea, the body politic. Paul uses that, of course, to describe the body of the church. And Leviticus operates on this kind of assumption that there's this linkage between the body and the individual body of the person and the body politic. Probably the scholar who's done most to develop this is Mary Douglas. She has a little book called Leviticus as Literature, and an earlier book called Purity and Danger. Mary Douglas was a cultural anthropologist, a British cultural anthropologist, who got interested in studying biblical texts, but from the perspective of cultural anthropologists. So a couple of the chapters in Purity and Danger have to do with Levitical issues, questions. She has a chapter on the food laws in Leviticus, and she's trying to explain with the tools of cultural anthropology what makes an animal unclean and what makes an animal clean. Her theory for the unclean and clean animals is that you have kind of paradigmatic model animals for each environment, and the animals that conform to that paradigm are clean. The animals that diverge from that paradigm are unclean. And she also connects that with the kinds of things that I was talking about earlier this afternoon. How unclean foods are connected with relations between different kinds of human beings, different categories of human beings. She makes that connection in talking about the food laws. So that's one of the essays in Purity and Danger. But she also has talked about a good bit about the link between the body, the human body, and the body politic, and the way that they kind of feed off each other or reflect each other. So we can take an example from something we talked about under the heading of priesthood. Priests are supposed to guard the house from contamination. Priests are supposed to guard the people from sin and rebellion by instructing them. Okay, that's an act of guarding for the body politic. That guarding image can be applied to the individual body. You're supposed to guard yourself against various kinds of influences, various kinds of associations. You have the priestly responsibility to guard your own heart. So the idea of guarding applies both to the individual and to the society, and you can think about those two things in tandem. And the priestly duty can be analogously applied to both. The same thing, you can think about the same kind of analogy between skin disease on a human body and contaminations and pollutions and infections that come into the body politic. The infections, the skin disease on the human body excludes people from the sanctuary. It keeps them from coming into the Lord's presence. It has to be purified and cleansed before they can come back into the Lord's presence. It makes them this mark on their body makes them outcasts. And it disrupts their life. It disrupts the functioning of their, not necessarily of their bodily functioning, but it definitely disrupts their social functioning. But you can have similar kinds of infections in the body politic. And I mean, this is the way that politicians, especially if you're a demagogue, politicians think about political life. What is wrong with our nation? Well, there's a certain element in our nation. Maybe it's a certain set of immigrants, or maybe it's a certain tribe that's living in our country, and they pose a threat. They are a kind of infection of the body politic. And what we need to do in order to save the body politic is to be the political surgeon and apply severe measures to cut out the cancer or the infection of this group within our nation. Okay. You're treating a group or person within a community as a sickness in the body, and you try to cut it out. So you might have to amputate something, you might have to try to deal with it with some kind of, you try to apply some kind of political medicine, whatever that form that might take, to try to eliminate the influence of this dangerous infection in your midst. So that's I think gives us ways to apply the skin disease legislation when we're thinking about Christian life and life in the church. We don't have to obey this anymore. We're not worried. If you got psoriasis, it's okay. If you got a bald head, you're clean. If you got a mark on your bald head, you're still clean. You don't get excluded by any marks on your bodies in the new covenant. But there are analogies to skin disease that mark a person and makes him unclean and unfit to be in the presence of God. Moral habits, moral sins, sins that have not been confessed and renounced, or they can occur within the church. And if there's an infection in the church, then that infection has to be dealt with. That's what church discipline is for, in part, to ensure that the infections that come into the body of Christ infect the whole body. Because they can. You can have something come into the body of Christ and then begins to spread. Somebody who's a false teacher and his false teaching begins to spread. Somebody who's just influencing people to abandon Jesus in one way or another, that begins to spread. And you need to discipline in order to prevent the spread of infection in the community. Okay. All right. Against that background, I'm going to read a couple of sections of Leviticus 13 and 14 just to get the flavor of the passage and to talk about some specifics in the leprosy legislation. This is the beginning of chapter 13. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, when a man has the skin of his body, or the skin of his flesh, a swelling or a scab or a bright spot, and it becomes a touch of leprosy, or touch of skin disease, on the skin of his body, then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of the sons the priests. And the priest shall look at the mark of the skin in the skin of his flesh, and the hair in the infection that is turned white, and the infection appears to be deeper than the skin of his flesh. It is an infection of leprosy, or a touch of skin disease. When the priest has looked at him, he shall pronounce him unclean. But if the bright spot is white on the skin of his body, and it does not appear to be deeper in the skin, and the hair on it is not turned white, then the priest shall isolate him who is in the infection for 7 days. And the priest shall look at him on the 7th day, and if in his eyes the infection has not changed, that is, the infection has stood still, is what the Hebrew says, and the infection is not spread on the skin, then the priest shall isolate him or shut him up for 7 more days. And the priest shall look at him again on the 7th day, and if the infection is faded and the mark has not spread on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is only a scab. He shall wash his clothes and be clean. Okay. I guess I'll read more. But if the scab spreads farther on the skin, after he has shown himself to the priest for his cleansing, he shall appear again to the priest, and the priest shall look. If the scab is spread on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is leprosy. Yeah. The scenario here begins with a person who recognizes on his body some mark which is described as a swelling or a rising up, a scab or a brightness that could possibly be leprosy, that could possibly be skin disease. The person who has the skin disease does not make that judgment himself about his cleanness or uncleanness. He has to be taken to the priest, or he goes to the priest, and the priests throughout this chapter, throughout chapter 13, are the inspectors of the bodies of the Israelites. They're the ones who look at the mark and determine whether it counts as leprosy. What they're looking at, as verse 3 indicates, there's several features that they're looking at. They're looking at the coloring of the hair in the place where the touch of skin disease has occurred. They're looking at the depth of the depression of the skin disease. How deep does it go into the skin? If it appears to be deeper than the skin of his flesh, it's an infection of leprosy, a touch of skin disease. And on the second inspection, the question is it spreading? Okay. So the three things he's looking for: the color of the hair, the depth of the dent in the skin, and I think particularly whether the underlying flesh is showing through underneath the skin. If it's gone through the layers of skin and you can see the musculature poking through, and then also if it's growing. I think the depth of the depression is the logic of that is tied to what I've said about flesh. Human beings are in Adam until rescued and made members of the last Adam. The first Adam is in the flesh, and the flesh is corrupted. The flesh is deathly flesh, and the flesh is when the flesh shows itself, or when something comes out of the flesh, then it needs that's what causes contamination. That's the inner man, the corrupted inner man coming out into the open. So when the skin disease goes lower than the skin and the flesh is showing through, then that's a sign that it's skin disease. But notice that the priest doesn't make a judgment on the first occasion either. Okay. He inspects the skin, the mark, looking for these symptoms, but then he sends the potential leper away for a week, and then on the seventh day there's another inspection, and now he's looking to see if the size of the infection has changed, whether it's spreading across the body. That would make it a living skin disease. Later on in Leviticus, there's a reference to living flesh. Living flesh, the spreading flesh. It's not only on the, it's not just a small mark on his skin, but it's beginning to take over his skin, and the flesh is beginning to assert itself through the skin and take over more of his body. If that's happening, then he's unclean. If, however, the priest looks at it on day one, he looks at the color of the hair, he looks at the depth of the skin disease, sends the guy away, comes back in a week, and inspects it the next week, and the skin disease is the same size and hasn't begun to spread further in the skin, then the priest says, "You're clean." He still has to wash his clothes, verse 6 says, but he's pronounced clean, and that's all he has to do. Okay. So that's the seventh day inspection. On the seventh day inspection, the priest might find that the scab is spreading further, he might find that the scab has changed and is spreading, and he needs to send him away and see him another 7 days from there. So there's an inspection on the first day, there's an inspection on the seventh day, there's an inspection on the 14th day, and the priest is looking for symptoms of depth of skin disease, color of the hair, and I think especially the spread, and he's determining whether there's a spreading scab or spreading mark that needs to be that is in fact skin disease. Okay, and it's a living skin disease, and is starting to take over the person. A couple notes on that. One is it's the priest who determines a cleanness or uncleanness. The phrase in my New American Standard Bible, if the mark has not spread, the priest shall pronounce him clean. That's in verse 6. The priest shall pronounce him clean. The verb is more straightforward than that. It doesn't say pronounce him clean, but rather make him clean. It's not because he's doing a rite of cleansing. It's because the priest's judgment about the mark is what makes the mark what it is. Okay. Does that make sense? The says this mark is skin disease, it is skin disease. He says this mark is not skin disease, it is not skin disease. It's like an umpire in a sports event. That sure looked like a foul. The umpire didn't call it. Is it a foul? For the purposes of the game, you just got to move on and get used to it. Even though, in the abstract, it might have all the qualities of a foul, but it wasn't called, and so it didn't happen. The umpire has that kind of creative power to declare certain events on the field to be fouls or not fouls. The priest has that kind of power. He's inspecting something. He's making a judgment about what he sees, but it's his pronouncement about it that makes it clean or unclean. The pronouncement is based on the conditions on the skin, but those require the judgment of the priest, and the priest is the one who makes that determination. Now, this is it's a category of speech act. Linguists study various uses of speech. There are certain kinds of speech acts that are just descriptions of what is the case. A speech act that I see the class sitting in their seats, attentively listening to me talk about skin disease. That's just a description. But some are speech acts that seek to accomplish something. If I said, Mikey, go open the door. I wouldn't be saying something about Mikey and what he was doing. It would be the kind of speech act that would be intended to affect Mikey to do something. And the speech act would not be perfected or felicitous if Mikey refused to follow especially, if I was somebody who was kind of in charge. And then there are certain kinds of speech acts that are performative, that actually bring into existence the state that they declare. So however you think about marriage involves performative speech acts. You can think about it as there's the couple, the husband, the groom, taking vows to each other, but their vows to each other are the words that constitute the marriage. They're not describing what is the case prior to the vows. They are making the marriage happen by saying that. Okay. Or you could think of it as, if you're thinking more in terms of the minister's role in a marriage, I now pronounce you man and wife. That's kind of the classic performative act. And when an authorized person pronounces something to be the case, then it becomes the case. It's a performative speech act. There's a great little book on this from the 70s probably called How to Do Things with Words. Can't remember any author's names today, but how to do things with words. Words aren't just to describe things, but you actually accomplish things with words. So that's what the priest is doing here. The priest has a performative power. I think when it says he makes it clean, it means that he's declaring it to be clean. He makes it unclean, he's declaring it to be unclean. But the pronouncement of the priest is what makes it what it is. Okay. I think there was something else I wanted to highlight here. The circumstance that I would think of would be cases of church discipline, where Jesus gives the apostles power so that what they declare on earth is done in heaven. So if I say to an impenitent sinner, you are excommunicated and you're no longer part of this fellowship, that is true because it's pronounced. So it's an authorized person, a minister, who has the authority over the person to excommunicate him. I think that's that would be an example of it. I think you could see it in I say that when I baptize, I'm doing this because I'm usually baptizing babies. And I don't pick up adults like this, but I'm usually baptizing babies. But I will say, so-and-so, child of the covenant, I baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's the water that is the performative thing, but I'm declaring something that's true. I'm not just describing what's happening, I'm declaring that this person is being baptized, and that this thing that's happening is not just this person getting wet on the head, but what's happening is that this person is receiving Christian baptism, and the declaration with the water is what makes it happen. So I think sacramental sorts of acts with the words that accompany them have the same kind of performative quality. Okay, I think let me look quickly here. Let me. One last thing before I look at another section of the passage, and that is the question of shutting up. That's often understood as a kind of quarantine, and especially if skin disease is thought of as an infectious disease, that could infect other people, and it's a danger to public health. This passage has sometimes been used. It was used during the pandemic, for example, when various governments were quarantining everybody. Healthy people, sick people. Typically in a pandemic, it's the sick people that get quarantined, so they don't infect the healthy people. But this passage was invoked by some Christians as a justification for quarantine. You shut people up when they're sick and they're potentially contagious. I don't think the isolation or the shutting up is a shutting up or an isolation outside the camp. That's a specific case, I think. I think he is in a kind of isolation. He may be isolated in his house, but he's just waiting for the next inspection. This is not an exclusion, but we go back to the term I used yesterday, is this kind of a liminal state. Between the day 1 inspection and the day 7 inspection, he doesn't yet know what his status is. He doesn't know whether he's clean or unclean. And he doesn't know it until he comes back and the priest inspects him. And sometimes even then he doesn't know because the priest has to send him away for another 7 days. So he's not in a state of uncleanness yet. He's not being excluded yet, but he's in this kind of in-between stage that is resolved. The in-between stage is resolved when the priest pronounces him either clean or unclean. Okay. The one time where you do have somebody who has to go outside the camp and have a kind of quarantine is in the case of somebody who has a mark on his bald forehead. A mark on his bald forehead that is judged by the priest to be skin disease. Look at chapter 13, verse 40 and following. Now, if a man loses the hair of his head, he is bald. He is clean. Got that? And if his head becomes bald on the front and the sides, he is bald on the forehead. He is clean. But if on the bald head or the bald forehead there occurs a reddish-white infection, it is leprosy breaking out on his bald head or on his bald forehead. Then the priest shall look at him, and if the swelling of the infection is reddish-white, he's looking at the color of this infection now, on his bald head or on his bald forehead, like the appearance of leprosy on the skin of the flesh, he is a leprous man. Notice how quickly this is done. There's no, I inspect now, I'm going to wait 7 days, see if it's spreading, wait to see what happens, examine it again 7 days later, and might give it another 7 days to see if it's spreading. This is a kind of instantaneous judgment. And he's described as a leprous man, verse 44, because he had this reddish-white infection, a swelling on his bald forehead. A couple things before we move on. One is the phrase leprous man, verse 44, that's not been used early in the chapter. Earlier in the chapter, the person who has skin disease has been judged clean or unclean. But this particular form of the word leprosy or skin disease has not been used because the other cases, you don't have a person who is identified as or identified by their leprosy. You have somebody who has skin disease, and when he gets better, then he can be cleansed. But he's not defined as a leprous man. But the man who has skin disease on his bald forehead, that's the leprous man. Okay. Why a skin disease on the bald forehead? Why does that matter? This goes back to what I was saying earlier about the connection with sweat and sweat of the brow, sweat of the head. This leprous man has a swelling, a kind of advanced and a kind of coagulated sweat, marker of the curse on his forehead. He's an Adam because he got this. He has this mark on his forehead. I think the forehead also is significant because this is a sign of his anti-priesthood. The priest has something on his forehead that designates him as belonging to the Lord, as I talked about in relation to Uzziah. Now you have an anti-priest who is identified by what's on his forehead. It's not the holy to the Lord, but it's skin disease that marks him as the opposite of a priest. And being the opposite of the priest, he goes as far away from the sanctuary as you can get and still be within the realm of Israel. He adopts a lifestyle and a dress that is the opposite end of the spectrum from the garments of glory and beauty of the priest. He becomes an anti-priest. Let me read the description of what he has to do. As for he is a leprous man, he is unclean. The priest shall surely pronounce him unclean, shall make him unclean. His infection is on his head. Also, the other thing I think that's significant about the forehead, if you have an infection of leprosy on the forehead, there's nothing covering it up. It's publicly visible to everybody. If you have it on your arm, you can wear long sleeves. Nobody knows you have it except the priest. You could probably keep it from the priest if you wanted to. Shouldn't, but you could. Try to sneak into the courtyard. You know that your arms are covered with eczema or psoriasis, but you wear long sleeves, and you hope the agent at the TSA check-in, the security gate at the airport, doesn't really check you. That's what the priest is going to be like. He's at the gateway of the tabernacle, and is he going to choose you as the pat down person, or is he going to just, you look clean enough, you might be able to sneak in. You shouldn't do that. That's a dangerous thing to do. But nobody can see it. Okay. Unless the priest says, hold on there, roll up your sleeves. What's underneath your sleeves? Or if you got it on your leg, pull up the skirt of your robe and let me see what's there. And if you got skin disease and he sees it, he should not let you go. He doesn't let you go through and go into the tabernacle, because that's a defilement that will make the Lord angry. But if you got it on your head, now you could wear a hat maybe, but it's more prominent. It's on the front of your face, and you lead with your skin disease, as it were, when you come into the presence of the Lord. So the priest shall pronounce him unclean. The infection is on his head. As for the leper who has the infection, his clothes shall be torn. Again, these are garments that have been ruined. He's done to his garments what the priest is never to do to his garments, which is to tear them. The hair of his head shall be disheveled or uncovered. And he shall cover his mustache and cry out. It's going to keeping people at a distance from him. This is the state of Uzziah. Uzziah gets leprosy on his forehead when he tries to go into the temple. He tries to seize priestly privilege. He becomes an anti-priest, and he is set outside the camp. And I don't know if he lived with his clothes torn, probably how he should have lived. And the shouting of unclean, unclean, implies that if you get near him or touch him, then you can pick up the the impurity from him. He shall remain unclean all the days of his life, which he hath infection, he is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. When a garment made of, then verse 47 talks about garments. Okay, he's outside the camp, not just outside the sanctuary area, but you've got, when Leviticus is revealed, you've got a couple million people camping around the tabernacle and distributed in different tribes. Outside the camp is quite a long ways away from the tabernacle, because it's like think of a refugee camp, one of the big refugee camps in Africa, where there's 1 million people living in a refugee camp. That's what the camp of Israel looks like in the wilderness. Better organized probably, but that's what it would look like. And being outside the camp means you're way out, away from the Lord. The high priest is inside the sanctuary, and the leper is way on the outside, the opposite end of the holiness spectrum. And he lives alone. Now, notice what the scope of what he's suffering. He can't go into the Lord's house. He can't participate in any of the feasts. So he's excluded from the worship of Israel. He's not just excluded from the worship of Israel, but he's not in his own home. He's outside the camp. So he's living somewhere else than his house. He's living alone in isolation. His wife and children aren't with him if he's married and has a family. He's separated from them. Anybody who gets within his vicinity, he tells them to stay away so that they don't get infected. It's not just it's not just that he's got, well, it's up here now. It's not just that he's got a form of disease, but his whole life has been dismantled. His social life, his family life, his participation in Israel's liturgical life, that's all been dismantled. And that's what's restored when we get to chapter 14 and you have the rite that we looked at yesterday, the ritual that brings him back into his status. He starts outside the camp, and when he's going through the day, the first set of rituals, he comes back into the camp and can be inside the camp but outside his own tent. And then after 7 days of that, he can go through the final purification ritual, and then he's restored not only to the Lord's tent but also to his own tent. His whole life is being put back together. He's being raised from the dead by this ritual of raised from the dead liturgically, raised from the dead socially. He's raised from the dead in terms of his family. That rite of cleansing, of purification, is a kind of resurrection rite that's restoring his life. Now we can also think ahead to the many episodes where Jesus heals lepers. There are individual lepers that are named, that are mentioned that Jesus heals. There are collections of lepers that Jesus heals. And then there are just references to him healing all kinds of diseases and cleansing all kinds of lepers. So no telling how many different lepers Jesus cleansed and healed in the course of his ministry. And in some of those cases, at least, if not in most, they would be lepers in this category. Excluded from Israel, excluded from their families, isolated and alone. The lifestyle of this leper resembles, looks to me like the lifestyle of the Gadarene demoniac. Remember that story in the Gospels, where Jesus encounters this demoniac who is impossible to tame. They tried to chain him up, and he breaks the chains. He's raging. He's strong, and he's lives among the tombs. He's in the place of the dead. His life is a living death, and the leper is in that kind of state. So when Jesus heals the lepers, he's reconstituting. He's bringing their whole life back together. He's giving them the life that they lost back to them. And more, of course, because he's inviting them to share in the new life that he has by his death and resurrection. Okay. Questions about that section, verses 40 to 46. Yeah, I haven't thought of that, but maybe the answer is to repeat what I said in another connection, which is that the evening sacrifice, the morning and evening sacrifice, provide a general covering of atonement for Israel on a daily basis. So maybe that provides the cleansing that he needs, that he can't get by appearing in the Lord's house. But that would, you think about just the psychology of a leper and thinking about exactly that question. I know I've sinned since I've been out here living alone with my clothes torn, telling people to stay away from me. I know I've sinned. I need to be reconciled to God, but I can't until this disease goes away. Yeah. That'd just be another aspect of the kind of living death that they're going through. Right? But I don't want to say that the Lord is not being merciful to them. I think they're still connected to Israel, even if they're way at the margins. And I think that means that the daily sacrifices are applying to them too. Just another example of lepers in the Bible. There's a story in 2 Kings about Samaria. Samaria is being besieged by, I don't remember whom, but there are a collection of lepers that are living outside the city, outside the city gates, and they're debating what they should do. They can't go back into the city because they're lepers. And they see this foreign army coming, say, let's take our chances and let's just go and throw ourselves on the mercy of this foreign army. Maybe they won't have the qualms about leprosy that Israelites do. And when they go out there, they find that the Lord has already chased away all of the army and all the plunder is there. And so this collection of lepers defeats and plunders the invading army. And then they decide they should go back and inform the people of Samaria that the army is gone after they fill themselves for a while and enjoy the plunder. Anyway, just another story. And the reason I thought of it was because there you have lepers in Israel after the settlement, and they're outside the camp. Seems to be outside the city. They're outside the city gates and they can't come in. The camp becomes the city when you go into the land. All right. The last section I want to read. Well, I'll just point to verses 47 and following in chapter 13. That's the section that has to do with leprosy on garments and leprosy on vessels. But then I want to look at the section at the end of chapter 14, which has to do with leprosy on buildings, on houses. I think this has some very interesting kind of resonance in other parts of the Bible. The Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron saying, this is verse 33 of chapter 14. 33 of chapter 14. When you enter the land of Canaan, which I will give you as a possession, and I put a mark of leprosy on a house in the land of your possession, and then the one who owns the house shall come and tell the priest, saying, something like a mark of leprosy has become visible to me in the house. The priest shall then order that they empty the house before the priest goes in to look at the mark, so that everything in the house need not become unclean. And afterward the priest shall go in and look at the house. So he shall look at the mark, and if the mark on the walls of the house has greenish or reddish depressions, and appears deeper than the face or the surface, then the priest shall come out of the house to the doorway and quarantine or shut up the house for 7 days. And the priest shall return on the seventh day and make an inspection. If the mark has indeed spread in the walls of the house, then the priest shall order them to tear out the stones with the mark in them and throw them away at an unclean place outside the city. And he shall have the house scraped all around inside, and they shall dump the plaster that they scrape off in an unclean place outside the city. Then they shall take other stones and replace those stones, and shall take other plaster and replaster the house. If, however, the mark breaks out again in the house after he has torn out the stones and scraped the house, after it has been replastered, Then the priest shall come and make an inspection. If he sees the mark has indeed spread in the house, it is a malignant mark on the house, it is unclean. He shall therefore tear down the house, its stones, its timbers, the plaster of the house, and he shall take the outside the city to an unclean place. Moreover, whoever goes into the house during the time that is quarantined becomes unclean until evening. Likewise, whoever lies down in the house shall wash his clothes, and whoever eats in the house shall wash his clothes. Okay. All right. Interesting things going on here. One of the interesting things is that you can have skin disease. It's the same word that's been used in chapter 13, skin disease in a house. It doesn't take the same exact form, but the symptoms or the signs of skin disease on a house or a leprous house are similar to the signs of disease on the skin. The priest is looking at the color of the mark on the house. He's looking at how much how deep it is, whether there's a depression in the wall of the house, whether it's deeper than the surface. Things he's looking for when he's looking at the skin and the mark on the skin, but in this case, it's the wall of a house. Another interesting thing here is that the mark on the house makes the interior an unclean interior that can pass on uncleanness. That's explicit at the end of this section. Whoever goes into the house during the time that he's shut it up becomes unclean until evening. If you enter the house that he's shut up and pronounced unclean, so the mark on the walls of the house communicates uncleanness to anyone present. Anyone who eats in the house incurs any uncleanness. Whoever eats in the house has to wash his clothes. The person who just steps into the house has to just wait until evening, and the clock runs out and he's clean again. If he actually sits down in the house and eats in the house, then he becomes contaminated, probably because he's spending more time there. He's eating the food in the house, which might have picked up the contamination of the house. But he needs to wash his clothes to be clean. So the space of the house becomes a communicator of uncleanness. Just like, as I've mentioned a couple of times, a corpse creates a space of uncleanness. It's interesting because in the case of other, if you got a leper running around, something unclean, he's saying, don't touch me, don't touch me. If you touch me, you become unclean. You have to have physical contact, skin-to-skin contact. If you become unclean from a woman who is having her menstrual period, you have to touch her, or have you touch something that she sat on, then you become tangible. You're actually touching something and it's communicating by contact. But in this case, with leprosy in the house, and in the case of the corpse in the house, the atmosphere, as it were, is contaminated. The interior of the house, the whole space, is contaminated. Anybody who enters that space becomes contaminated. There are two stages of solution to this. One stage, well, I guess three. One stage is the priest comes in, inspects, finds that there's a mark in the house. He shuts it up, comes back a week later, inspects it again, and finds that it's gone or it's retreating, it's getting smaller. So it's not leprosy and it's just clean. It's fine. If he comes back the next week and he finds that it's spreading, it's a living skin disease in the walls of the house, that means the house is contaminated. And the solution to that, the first solution to that, is to remove the portion of the house that's contaminated. You just remove the cancer. You don't kill the patient. You remove the cancer first, and you take out the blocks that are around it. You scrape off the plaster, and you replace that. If that takes care of it, then the house is clean and everything is fine. But that's not necessarily the end of it. If you take out a portion of it and clean a portion of the infected portion, and then that's all repaired, and you come back and the skin disease has reappeared in the house, then the house is beyond repair and the house has to be demolished. And it's demolished quite thoroughly. He shall tear down the house, verse 45, its stones, its timbers, all the plaster of the house. He shall take them outside the city to an unclean place. Okay. That's a thoroughgoing demolition job. Because you've got some kind of mark in the house, maybe some kind of mildew, a mold in the house that you can't control, that's marking the house and it needs to be destroyed. Okay. To my recollection, there isn't any case in the Bible where this inspection of a house actually occurs for the house of an individual person. Where you do have this kind of thing happening is in relation to the temple, the house of God. And you have it in a couple of different places. Ezekiel, I mentioned this earlier in the week, Ezekiel, in a vision at the beginning of Ezekiel, goes on an inspection of the walls, interior walls of the temple. He doesn't find mildew on the walls of the temple, but he finds images of animals, creeping things, idols that are carved into the walls of the temple. And the temple is infected and contaminated because of the idolatry of the temple. And that's a sign that the house is going to be demolished, just as this house is in Leviticus 14. That temple, that Solomon's temple, that Ezekiel, who is a priest, he goes on an inspection tour of the temple, and he finds it's beyond hope. It's got this infection. The infection cannot be removed, and the house needs to be destroyed. And partway through Ezekiel, announcement that the temple has been, the Jerusalem captured, and the temple has been torn down. Okay, so that Ezekiel is the inspecting priest. Jesus is an inspecting priest too in the Gospels. This is particularly the case. He goes to the temple. John's Gospel goes to the temple a couple of times, but in the other Gospel, he goes into the temple toward the end of his ministry, after his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. He goes immediately into the temple. And in Mark, it says he went into the temple and looked around and went out. But then he comes back and he does his action in the temple, overturns the money changers, declares it's a house of, it's a den of thieves. And then in following prophecy says, I tell you the truth, he tells his disciples, I tell you the truth, not one stone will be left on another. This entire house is going to be torn down. Jesus is applying the logic of Leviticus 14 to the temple. He inspects the temple. In Mark's gospel, he goes in twice to look at the temple. He looks at first, that's the first inspection, looks like it's contaminated, goes out, comes back, yes, it's contaminated, and he does this kind of proto-destruction by tossing things around and interrupting the service of the temple. And then he pronounces it, as the priest does here in chapter 14, he pronounces it unclean, and he says that it will be demolished in very much the way that the skin-diseased house is demolished in Leviticus 14:45. Okay? Yeah. He's presenting Jesus as the inspecting priest, right? Right. Yeah. He's like the priest in Leviticus 14, and like Ezekiel, he's the one who's inspecting the house to see if it can be recovered. Okay. Let me read the last bit of chapter 14, just to close it out. So it's followed through the case where you remove part of the wall, replace the wall, and then the mark reappears, and then you have to demolish the house. You might repair the wall, and the mark doesn't reappear, and that's what verse 48 and following describe. You still have to go through a rite that will be a cleansing rite for the house. If, on the other hand, the priest comes and makes an inspection and the mark has not indeed spread in the house after the house has been replastered, then the priest shall pronounce the house clean because the mark has not reappeared. To cleanse the house, then, he shall take 2 birds and cedar wood and a scarlet string and hyssop. Anybody remember where we've seen those items before? We read exactly that list yesterday, I think. Two birds, cedar wood, scarlet string, hyssop. Don't have enough for an offering? Yeah, no, that wasn't the context.
Is that in the priesthood? It's related to the priest.
It is related to the priest, but it's specifically related to something else. It's actually earlier in chapter 14 when the person who has leprosy is being cleansed. You get the same materials, and the rite is going to be very similar. Okay. Let me finish reading, and then we'll think about what that means. So you take the same materials, 2 birds, cedar wood, scarlet string, hyssop. You shall slaughter one of the birds in an earthenware vessel over running water. You shall take the cedar wood and the hyssop and the scarlet string with the live bird and dip them in the blood of the slain bird as well as the running water and sprinkle the house 7 times. All that is very similar to what was described earlier in the chapter. He shall cleanse the house with the blood of the bird and with the running water along with the live bird and with the cedar wood and the hyssop and the scarlet string. However, he shall let the live bird go free outside the city into the open field. He shall make atonement for the house, and it shall be clean. It's interesting. So the purpose of doing that ritual for the leper was to restore him to this kind of priestly status. Here you're doing it for a house. That doesn't seem. In what sense can that rite be a link up with the priesthood? I think the logic is this: just as cleansing a leper who is an anti-priest reunites him to the priest, which brings him nearer to God, so if you have a contaminated house and then it's cleansed, that brings it nearer to the Lord's house and links it up with the Lord's house, which suggests that if that's right, then the premise of that is that the Lord's house, which is at the center of Israel, the tabernacle in the case of the wilderness camp, the temple once they enter into the land, that is a kind of there are somehow connection points from all the houses in Israel to the temple, or all of the houses in Israel are, you could say, outposts of the temple, that'd be an interesting theory to test out and see how that works and what kinds of implications that has for how Israelites lived out in the land and out in the community. If they saw their houses as kind of small scale tabernacles or temples that are extensions of the Lord's house, what would that mean? So I'm just raising that as a question.
Yeah.
I've been saying this all day, but I just wanted to read it to prove to you that it's actually in the Bible. Chapter 15 is about genital emissions. They're said to be from the flesh. The word flesh appears all over the place in chapter 15. Beginning of verse 2, when any man has a discharge from his flesh, his discharge is unclean. And whenever you see, my Bible translate that word as body, but those are 2 distinct words in the Hebrew. The word for flesh is basar. Can't remember the word for body at the moment, but they're 2 distinct words. And the fact that it's flesh is significant. That's the word that's used. A couple of things to say about that term. In terms of literal, what literally is your flesh? Your flesh is the muscle and cartilage that is between your skin and your interior and your interior organs. Okay, so or your skeleton, right? So the flesh is the musculature that surrounds your skeleton and your interior organs. So you could think of a human being as being kind of 3-layered. You got skin on the outside. You've got an inner covering of flesh, which includes fat. There's a layer of fat that is covering your entrails. And then you've got bones and interior organs that are the innermost being. And usually it's the interior organs that are thought of as the innermost parts. And flesh is in between the two. I think a lot to say about flesh that I'm not going to try to unpack all here, but just I've said this before. I'll just repeat this. When flesh appears through the skin, that's a mark of uncleanness. That's what skin disease is. When something comes from the flesh, and in this case specifically from the sexual organs, then that's contaminating because it's an emission from the flesh. Their flesh is, the word flesh specifically refers to genitals, again, as it does when you're talking about circumcision, the flesh of the foreskin. The removal of the flesh in circumcision is the removal of the flesh from the penis. That's the specific meaning of the term flesh. And those are related to, as I've said already, being in Adam. You want flesh to be controlled and contained. If flesh breaks out, then that's dangerous. So you need it controlled and contained. When flesh moves out from the interior out into the exterior, that is a cause of uncleanness. All of this, I think, is background to what Paul means when he talks about flesh. We translate the term flesh, many of our Bibles translate the word flesh as sinful nature or something along those lines. I think that's not a great translation because it doesn't link up Paul's usage of the word. He's writing in Greek, but it's the same concept. Linkage of the word with the theology of flesh that you have back in Leviticus. So I think Paul is working in the same conceptual realm as Leviticus when he talks about flesh. And the kinds of things he says about the works of the flesh is a kind of extrapolation of what Leviticus is talking about. The works of the flesh are the ungodly works that arise from the fleshly heart, that rise from the self-protectiveness of flesh, and the rules of uncleanness portray that as flesh breaking out through the skin or things coming through the flesh. It's the same dynamic as Jesus said too, the interior things that come out. Those Leviticus and its theology of flesh, Jesus' statement about the thing that contaminates it comes out of you, Paul's discussion of works of the flesh, those are all working in the same conceptual realm. Okay. That was one general thing about this chapter. The part I wanted to read was the part that I've been referring to. And then I'll read a bit more of it. When a woman has a discharge, if her discharge in her flesh is blood, she shall continue in her menstrual impurity for 7 days. Whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. Everything also on which she lies during her menstrual impurity shall be unclean, and everything on which she sits shall be unclean. And anyone who touches her bed shall wash his clothes and bathes in water and be unclean until evening. And whoever touches anything on which she sits, shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. Whether it be on the bed or the thing on which he is sitting, when he touches it, he shall be unclean until evening. And if a man actually lies with her, so that her menstrual impurity is on him, he shall be unclean 7 days, and every bed on which he lies is unclean. Okay? So there are various degrees of impurity that you can contract by being in the same house with a woman during her menstrual period. Sometimes it's fairly minor, and you just are unclean until evening, or you have to wash. Sometimes it's, if you have sex with a woman during her menstrual period, then you're unclean 7 days, and you have to go through some kind of cleansing. What's the cleansing rite for a woman at the end of her flow of blood? The explanation we have, first of all, we don't really have a purification rite for the woman who has her normal monthly period. It comes to an end, and then it's over. She's not contaminating anything anymore. It doesn't say exactly how she becomes clean. I think it's a matter of washing her clothes, and she's unclean after she's healed. But if a woman has a discharge of blood many days, that's the case in verse 25, not at the period of her menstrual impurity, or if her discharge extends beyond that period, all the days of her impure discharge, she shall continue as though in her menstrual impurity she is unclean. Continuing in her menstrual impurity means not only that she's unclean and unable to come into the sanctuary, but also that she's contaminating everything around her. That's what it means to be in that. Now, when she's clean from her discharge, verse 28, she shall count off herself 7 days. Afterwards, she shall be clean. Then on the 8th day, she shall take for herself 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest to the doorway of the tent of meeting. And the priest shall offer the one for the sin offering and the other for the burnt offering. So the priest shall make atonement on her behalf before the Lord because of her impure discharge. Okay. This is another case where we have a cleansing ritual that looks like just a ritual segment of the larger ritual of priestly ordination. It's a ritual segment in the temporal structure. So she becomes clean from her discharge. Counts 7 days. There's a 7+1 structure as there is in the ordination rite, and it's the 8th day when she actually does the purification and completes her cleansing. That's just like the priests becoming priests. On the 8th day, she offers 2 offerings, a sin offering and a burnt offering. We saw that back in chapter 12 when it was talking about cleansing from childbirth. Again, it's a small segment of the ordination rite. And the woman who's been in this long-term menstrual impurity is now being restored to her connection with the priest, therefore to the tabernacle, therefore with Yahweh, through this ritual that is a small piece of the ordination rite. Okay. So I hope it's clear, but I'll keep saying it. I'll say it one last time. Probably won't be the last time. The ordination rite for the priest is the paradigm, I think, against which all the other cleansing rituals in Leviticus are measured. To know what the sacrifices mean and know how they work, I think we need to look at Leviticus 8 and 9. All right, one last kind of this is not in the book of Leviticus, but in the book of Numbers, is in Numbers chapter 19. This is about corpse defilement. Corpse defilement, touching a corpse, being in the same room with the corpse, is a very serious form of uncleanness, which lasts a while. This is the last purity legislation in the Pentateuch. In fact, it's the last legislation of any kind in the Pentateuch. From this time to the end of Numbers, you just have narratives, and then Deuteronomy doesn't give any new rituals or rules of purification. This is the last of those rules of purification. The chapter begins with a description of a concoction of a special water of purification, which is made from the ashes of a red heifer that's been burned. Cedar wood and hyssop and scarlet material have been put into the fire with the red heifer. So the same materials that you used back in chapter 14 of Leviticus to cleanse the house and to cleanse the leper. But now they're all being burned. And then ashes from that fire are taken and put in water. And that mixture of the ashes and the water makes the water of purification. Water of the purification is specifically it's only used for cleansing from corpse defilement. There aren't any uses that are prescribed for it. Let me find the one section of the passage that I wanted to. Yeah. Verses 11 through 13. The one who touches the corpse of any person shall be unclean for 7 days. Stop there for a second. How long were you unclean if you touched the corpse of an animal?
1 day.
What's that?
1 day.
Yeah, you're just the rest of the day until the evening. Right? If you picked it up, then a little bit more, you got to wash your clothes. But it's just 1 day. Human corpses are much more unclean and impure than animal corpses. That, I think, is worth pondering. So 7 days you're unclean. The one who shall purify himself from uncleanness with the water on the 3rd day and on the 7th day then he shall be clean. If he does not purify himself on the third day and on the seventh day, he shall not be clean. Anyone who touches a corpse, the body of a man who has died, and does not purify himself, defiles the tabernacle of the Lord. That person shall be cut off from Israel, because the water for impurity has not been sprinkled on him. He shall be unclean. His uncleanness is still with him. Okay. The thing I want to pick out from this is the temporal pattern of this ritual, which is this is the only time we see it. We've been seeing purification rites that are just a matter of coming to the end of the day and washing your clothes. In some cases, it's a week pattern, 7 days, and then eighth day rituals, various kinds of things. This is the only thing you have a week that's bisected into a 3-day period, the third day and the seventh day. So the man who's has become unclean by contact with a human corpse has to come in the third day. He's sprinkled by the water purification. He comes in the seventh day, and he's sprinkled by the water purification for his final cleansing. That third day, seventh day sequence, as a sequence for cleansing from corpse defilement, I think is typologically and theologically significant. The washing with this water purification gives the person who's contaminated a kind of resurrection, because he's been taken out of a state where he's defiled by a corpse, defiled by death, directly defiled by death, and now he's being sprinkled in order to make him come alive again and to remove the death that's on him. Okay, it's a resurrection image, and it's a kind of resurrection by baptism, but it's a double resurrection by baptism. He is baptized or washed on the third day, sprinkled on the third day by this water, and then on the seventh day. So he goes through a resurrection in the middle of the week, on the third day, and then the final resurrection comes on the seventh day. And I hope that I've said this in a way that is making you think of New Testament-y stuff, because the New Testament is all about a double resurrection, one of which takes place on the third day, Jesus, the head. The other one, which will take place on the seventh day, that is the seventh day of the week of human history, in the final Sabbath, when we'll be raised and we'll be finally delivered from all death defilement. Okay. So there's an image of the double resurrection in the New Testament that's in that passage. I wanted to point you to that. All right. I'm going to go back to this distinction from Jonathan Clowens. Ritual versus moral impurity, or as I'm calling it, sanctuary versus land impurity. What we've been looking at is all sanctuary impurity. It's all ritual or ceremonial impurity. Things that your body does that make you unclean, or sometimes contact with things from outside makes you unclean, that prevents you from going into the tabernacle. It makes you ceremonially unclean. And it registers, it's recorded on the tabernacle, and the tabernacle itself has to be cleansed. Moral impurity is not, it doesn't have to do with bodily processes or contact with things that are impure, but has to do with decisions, moral actions, has to do with your moral agency. And when you do things, and when Israel as a whole does things that violate the commandments of God, then they become morally impure. And as the ritual impurities register and are recorded on the tabernacle, the moral impurities are registered and recorded on the land. Yep.
How is the moral is connected with the land?
We'll see that in just a second. If you still have that question in 10 minutes, ask it again. So that's the distinction that's being made. What is it that contaminates the land? Well, we have some examples of this in Leviticus, chapter 18. Leviticus 18 we'll look at tomorrow. It's about sexual sins, incest, adultery, homosexual sodomy, and other things. But it ends with this, verse 24. Do not defile yourselves by any of these things, any of these sexual sins. By all of these, the nations which I am casting out from before you have become defiled. For the land has become defiled. Therefore I have visited its punishment upon it. So the land has spewed out its inhabitants. That's one of the passages that I alluded to earlier in the day where certain kinds of sins make the land sick to its stomach. And then it needs to expel the infection by vomiting out the infection, which is the people. So the land has done that with the Canaanites. That's why the Canaanites are being expelled, because they've defiled the land with their sexual sins. They defiled the land with other sorts of sins, and the land has become sickened and is spewing them out. Yeah. Sexual sins in that case, if we look over to verse 28, we see the same kind of thing. Another reference, that's just a repeated reference. I'll keep reading from verse 26, still in Leviticus 18. But as for you, you are to keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not do any of these abominations, neither the native nor the alien who sojourns among you. For the men of the land who have been before you have done all these abominations, the land has become defiled, so that the land may not spew you out, should you defile it, as it spewed out the nations who were before you. That's kind of repeating it, what I just said. The land has been defiled in the past by the Canaanites. It's spewing them out. If you become Canaanites, if you act like Canaanites, if you have sex like Canaanites, then the land is going to get sick of you too, and you're going to be expelled. Yeah. So sexual sin is one of the things that defiles the land. Idolatry also defiles the land. Let me make sure that this is a relevant passage before I turn you to it. I'll take you to Deuteronomy 4. Excuse me. This doesn't use the language of defilement, but it has a similar kind of dynamic going on. Deuteronomy 4, verse 25. When you become the father of children and children's children and have remained long in the land and act corruptly and make an idol in the form of anything, and do that which is evil in the sight of the Lord so as to provoke him to anger, I call heaven and earth to witness against you that you shall surely perish quickly from the land where you are going to over Jordan to possess it. You shall not live long in the land. You shall be utterly destroyed. The Lord will scatter you among the nations. You shall be left few in number among the nations where the Lord shall drive you. There you will serve gods, not the work of men's hands. Gods, the work of men's hands, wood and stone, which neither see nor hear nor eat nor smell. But from there you will seek the Lord your God, and you will find him if you search for him with all your heart and with all your soul. Okay? That doesn't use the language of defilement, but it's the same kind of dynamic where if Israel indulges in idolatry, then they're going to be driven from the land. The land is the land won't tolerate them. The Lord won't tolerate them in the land. They'll perish quickly from the land because of their idolatry. So idolatry, sexual sin, and then the shedding of innocent blood is another thing that defiles and contaminates the land and causes the land to be uninhabitable. Let me again see. Yeah. Look at the end of Numbers 33, beginning in verse 29. 33, Numbers 33, verses 29 and following. And these things shall be for a statutory ordinance to you throughout your generations, all your dwellings. If anyone kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death at the evidence of witnesses. No person shall be put to death on the testimony of one witness. Moreover, you shall not take ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death. And you shall not take ransom for him who has fled to the city of refuge, that he should return to the land before the death of the high priest. So you shall not pollute the land in which you are, for blood pollutes the land, and no expiation can be made for the land for the blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of the one who shed it. and you shall defile the land in which you live, in the midst of which you dwell. For I, the Lord, am dwelling in the midst of the sons of Israel. Okay. Numbers 35 is the passage about the cities of refuge. Cities of refuge are an institution that's established when Israel goes into the land. If somebody kills somebody in the land, that defiles the land, as this passage says. It pollutes the land. Something has to be done. The agent of justice at this stage in Israel's history is not the state or a court or police. It's the avenger of blood, who is a near relative of the person who died. And the avenger of blood is responsible for carrying out the death penalty against the person who shed the blood. The person who shed blood, the manslayer, can flee to a city of refuge. There are a bunch of them around the land. He goes to the nearest city of refuge, and he presents his case to the elders of the city of refuge. And if they say, you committed murder, you were waiting for this guy, you wanted to kill this guy for years, we know you hated him. You can't come into our city of refuge. There's the avenger of blood out there waiting for you. Good luck. You got to deal with him. But if they look at the case and they decide that it was accidental, that it was not done in anger, it was not done with planning, if it was something like the regular example of an accidental death is death by flying axe head. Two men are out in the woods chopping wood, and the head of one axe flies off and goes through the air and knocks the other guy in the head and kills him. That's the paradigmic case of accidental death. I don't know what that says about the quality of ancient Israelite axes, but it sounds like they weren't high quality.
We still have that kind of axes.
Yeah, the axe head flies off all the time? Oh, okay. Well.
But we don't have so for the future.
Yeah. So if it's something like that, he goes to the city of refuge. The elders of the city of refuge have to investigate and determine that. And if it is in fact not murder, but accidental killing, unintended killing, then he's led into the city of refuge, and he lives in the city of refuge as long as the current high priest is alive. When the current high priest dies, then he goes out of the city of refuge and returns to wherever he came from. If he's in the city of refuge, he might be there for, if you got a young high priest, he might be there for 15 or 20 years. He can move his family into the city of refuge, and he can make kind of a normal life in the city of refuge. But he can't go out. If he goes out of the city of refuge, out of the precincts of the city of refuge, the angel of blood, the blood avenger has the right to chase him down and kill him, because still you have the blood that was shed. And it seems like what's happening is that the blood shed by the manslayer can be atoned for in a couple of different ways. By the blood that's been shed can be atoned for by the blood of the manslayer. If the manslayer has not committed murder, but rather manslaughter, accidental killing, then what covers that sin is the death of the high priest. And that seems to reset things. So the high priest's death seems to be functioning in kind of a quasi-atoning way in the city refuge system. So that's the setup here. And the reason why all this has to take place, as the end of the chapter indicates, is because blood shed on the land pollutes the land. This is moral or land defilement. And it has to be taken away. So if you have innocent blood that's shed over years and years and years, and nobody does anything to avenge it, you're in big trouble. The land is not going to tolerate that. The land is going to get sick and vomit you out. The Lord is going to remove you from the land. And there's no sacrificial way to get out of that. The way to get out of shedding innocent blood, the innocent blood, the way to atone for that is by executing those who've shed blood. The way to atone for the kinds of sexual sin that pollute the land is to stop committing those sexual sins. It's repentance and turning from those things. You can stop the contamination of idolatry by destroying all the idols. There's not a sacrifice that takes care of that. And if these sins accumulate, then that's when Israel is carried off into exile. That's what the prophets talk about. These are the sins that they charge against Israel, among several other sins. Idolatry, shedding of innocent blood, sexual sin, and then often injustices against the poor. Those are the things that make the land want the people to leave. Yeah. So the city of Sodom and Gomorrah is doing a couple of things that are defiling the land. The obvious thing that we think of is the sexual sin of the men of Sodom, and that defiles the land. But in Ezekiel, when Ezekiel talks about Sodom, he describes them as oppressing strangers and the poor, and he condemns Sodom for its injustice to the weak. Both of those things are going on in Sodom. You can tell it's an inhospitable city when you're a stranger and you come into the city, and everyone in the city, all the men in the city get together and want to gang rape you. Then you know you're in an inhospitable city that does not welcome strangers, because that is not the way you're supposed to welcome strangers. So the sexual sin and the injustice to strangers and outsiders, those two things are two sides of the same sin. But yeah, that's a really good example. Sodom is a paradigm case of a city that has committed these sins, and the Lord wipes it off the map. Yeah, good. Thank you. Okay, there are, I think, pretty clear New Testament references to this category of moral impurity, and where the category operates most directly is within the church. When churches are contaminated by sexual sin, and when churches are contaminated by idolatry, and when churches are contaminated by abuses of the weak, maybe not to the extent of murder, but abuses of the weak. When churches act like that, then the Lord will spew them out. The language I'm using is coming directly from Revelation 3. First of all, let's look at Revelation 2, a couple of past verses in Revelation 2 to set up the context. These are the letters of Jesus to the seven churches of Asia in Revelation 2 and 3. 2:14, to the church at Pergamum. Verse 14, I have a few things against you, because there are some among you who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who kept teaching Balak to put stumbling blocks before the sons of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, idolatry, and to commit acts of immorality. The Greek word is porneia, from which we get pornography. Porneia. Sexual immorality specifically. So the thing that Jesus has against the church of Pergamum is these two kinds of sins that are land defilement sins in the Old Testament. Then look at verses 20 and 21. This is now to the church of Thyatira. But I have this against you, that you tolerate the woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess. She teaches and leads my servants astray, so that they commit acts of immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols. I give her time to repent, and she does not want to repent of her immorality. Both cases, immorality is porneia. Again, we have another church who's committing some version of these sins that are land polluting sins in the Old Testament. And these churches are being polluted by that. We see the effect of this, again drawn from this Old Testament pattern when we get to the church at Laodicea, where Jesus says in chapter 3, verse 15, I know your deeds, that you're neither hot nor cold. I would that you were hot or cold, but because you are lukewarm and neither hot or cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. That's Jesus speaking. He's going to spit the church of Laodicea out of his mouth because they are neither hot nor cold. That language isn't used in the previous letters, but Jesus is Jesus' letters are operating in the realm of these defilements, these land defilements, and the churches are guilty of some of these land defilement sins, and they are going to be spewed out of the body of Christ. Jesus is our land, and we're incorporated into Jesus' body, but if we persist in idolatry and persist in sexual immorality, then Jesus will vomit us up out of his body. That's the warning to the Laodiceans. Okay, so that's one indication in the New Testament. These principles are operative in the church. Samuel's question is whether we can say the same thing about nations today. Are nations contaminated and lands contaminated in the same way that Israel's land was by the same kinds of sins? Yes, I think the answer is yes, but I'll make one qualification to that. The qualification is that there is a uniqueness to the land that God had chosen for Israel. That's the Holy Land. That's his designated land. I think part of the reason why the Canaanites are treated so harshly is because they are abusing the land that Yahweh had claimed for himself. He claimed that land all the way back to the time of Abraham. And then the Canaanites have been there, and they've been abusing that particular land that belongs to Yahweh. Now, how does that apply in the New Testament? One way to apply it in the New Testament is say, there is no land that's like that. There's no holy land in the New Testament era. Ethiopia isn't a holy land in that sense, a chosen land that's specifically chosen by God. The U.S. isn't that land that's specifically chosen by God as the land for his people. And so whatever analogies we could draw would be more distant analogies, that these same kinds of principles apply, but perhaps not as strictly as they did to Israel. The other way to go is to think, instead of saying God chose one land in the Old Covenant, now he doesn't choose any, we could say God chose one land in the Old Covenant, now he's selected many lands, and he dwells in many different lands, still distinct in some way from ancient Israel, but wherever his church has been established, there's a holy place in that land. The temple has been established in that land, just as much as the temple Solomon was built in the land of Israel. There's been a temple of the Lord here in Ethiopia for 1,800 years, something along those lines. So that you could argue that makes Ethiopia not exactly Israel, but an extension of Israel. And God is doing the same thing with lots of other lands. Countries in Europe have been claimed by God by the presence of his temple for centuries also. The U.S. were the upstarts, but I think we could talk about the U.S. as being similar. So in that case, that makes these rules apply much more readily. And so if you have a country that's where the Lord's house is established, as in Ethiopia, as in the United States, and you have that nation full of innocent blood, full of sexual immorality, full of idolatry, then the land is going to rebel against that people. I think that's the direction I would want to apply it. So I think these principles do apply, and we should be I'm thinking of the U.S. particularly, this is what I know best. The U.S. I think needs to be should be frightened that we're continuing to kill thousands of unborn babies a day. Should be really frightened at the promotion and celebration of sexual perversions, which we've been doing for some time now. A little bit of sanity has been restored in the last couple of weeks, fortunately, but still there's lots of insanity out there. So innocent blood, sexual immorality, various forms of idolatry, those are things that do characterize American life. And I don't think the Lord will tolerate those forever. I think the Sodom example is important in this respect, though. When the Lord threatened to destroy Sodom, he was willing, after Abraham's intercession, he was willing to spare Sodom for the sake of 10 righteous people in the city. There weren't that many. So a faithful church, even a small remnant of a faithful church in a country that is full of polluting idolatries and sins, a small faithful church can still be a preservative and hold the judgment at bay. So that's an encouragement in situations where we have, and I think that I do think that's happened in the U.S. Because you have had established. I don't know if you followed the abortion issue in the U.S., but we had from 1973 to 2023, abortion was treated as a constitutional right in the United States because of its Supreme Court decision back in 1973. And you could put some small restrictions on it, but basically it's a right to abortion that could be at any point in the pregnancy. That was overturned by the Supreme Court in 2023, fortunately. Doesn't eliminate abortion, it just means states now have control of that, and states adopt different policies with regard to abortion. So some states are very open to abortion, even encourage abortion. Some states are very restrictive. So it's still not a good situation. But why did I start talking about the abortion issue in the U.S.? That's think innocent blood. How more innocent can you get than the blood of unborn babies? How much more blood can you imagine being spilled? More than any war that the U.S. Vastly more than any war the U.S. has ever been involved in. The number of unborn children who've been aborted. But why hasn't the Lord just, fire from heaven on the U.S.? Why doesn't that happen? And I do think it's because the Lord has preserved a remnant of faithful believers that are kind of preservative in the U.S. It's not a small number. It's not a huge number, but it's not a small number in the U.S. So I think that's what's holding the reins on judgment. And so if you think about the situation here in Ethiopia, whatever forms those three sins take in your country, you want those to be overturned. You want the evils to end, but in the meantime, building up faithful believers, faithful churches, is the way that you preserve. It preserves the church and preserves enough of the country so that you can rebuild when the church gets strong enough. Yeah, I think that's a valid kind of analogy to use. I think that's the way we should use the Bible, that we have biblical storylines and models of how Israel was working at different times in its history, and we should be trying to discern where we are in our particular location, where the church is in relation to that. And so exile would be one category where the church is weak, the church is dominated by a secular, unbelieving culture, and we seek the peace of the city. That's the instruction from Jeremiah. And we also pray for the Lord to help the church to grow, so that it's not good. We shouldn't be content with being a punching bag for wicked people. That's not something we should like. That's not something the Lord likes. We should suffer with joy. Yes, that's suffering in Christ. Yes, but what we want is the Lord to establish justice, and that can't happen unless wicked people are overthrown. So yeah, I think that's one paradigm. The other paradigm, we had a couple of essays on the book of Judges on the Theopolis website a couple of weeks ago, and one of the guys was arguing that in the U.S. now, the paradigm of exile has been used a lot over the last 30 or 40 years in the U.S. to think about how the church fits in within contemporary society. But his suggestion was that the book of Judges may be a better paradigm at this point, where you still have a kind of exile with, the Philistines are in charge, but in the book of Judges, the judges didn't just settle in and let the Philistines rule, Samson starts doing things that provoke change and shake things up. And so at certain points, you may still have a dominant opposing power, but what you're called to do is something more aggressive. And so that'd be another kind of paradigm to think about. Obviously, you don't know for sure which one you're in, but you read the Bible prayerfully and you try to find the paradigms in Scripture that fit your circumstances.